I'm going to turn the mic over to our speaker, Justin.
Yes. Thank you, Kat. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to deliver this talk. Last month, I gave this talk at RVA Sec, and it was really well received, and we had a lot of fun. And we're also going to have a lot of fun today. So my talk is called Honeypot Boo Boo, Better Breach Detection with Deception, Inception, because it's fun to be wordsmithing. So a little bit about myself. I'm a authorized partner with Canary. I don't actually work at Canary, but I've worked with them for several years and collaborated, and I'm very passionate about their product and platform because I've personally seen it prevent 3 catastrophic breaches, trip up some of the most elite red teams in the world, and have pen tests fail within 8 minutes, and easy, cheap, effective stuff. And so today I'm going to give you an overview of what we're doing now as far as breach detection, why it's not working, and some ideas for what we may try to do better moving forward, and also walk you through various deployment scenarios for different types of Canary tokens and honeypots. And with that, let's kick things off. So for starters, we need to talk about what's a honey trap. A honey trap can be a honeypot or a honey token. And a honeypot is a device that's designed to look like a real service and a real system that's running attractive services. And you have tokens, which are digital tripwires that can be manifested as Google Docs, AWS keys, Slack tokens, you name it. Both of these mechanisms represent the larger discipline of deception technology. And this is really fun because the more creative you are, the more likely you'll be able to thwart your adversary. And at some point, you're going to have a situation of psychological warfare where you're going to get them to question their sanity. And we'll get to that here in a bit. The reason we need something new is because it takes entirely too long to detect breaches. It's costing more and more money every year, and exponentially, breaches continue happening. So we also have tons of burnout. You know, the security community is in dire need of people, millions of jobs, depending on what report you read. You have burnout, you have disaffection, and there's better ways that we need to be looking at this to help our security professionals. And most importantly, if you do get breached, because you will, it's not a matter of if, it's when, the idea is you want to mitigate the blast radius, because you want to know exactly at that point that you've been breached and not 212 days later. So some of you probably know the pyramid of pain and laundry room Viking. You know, for the analysts out there, this might be so true it hurts, but, you know, the idea is early on, you know, as an analyst, maybe you work 100 hours a week, and you're not going to go to bed, so you just triage tickets instead, and you might get ahead for the time being, but you'll soon end up dead. So, in other words, we need to help our analysts because it's really hard, and I have a lot of respect for people, but a lot of the time they're spending a lot of their cycles on false positives and, you know, alerts that don't have any fidelity. So I feel for them. And really, like, why deception technology of all things? I do believe this is the year, the inflection point, when deception technology really has started to take off because people need a new way of thinking about this. And you've just looked back over the last decade at some of the largest breaches, you know, going back to 2013 with Snowden. You know, you had the most sophisticated spying agency and security organization in the world, and Snowden just rummaged around for long periods of time, exfiltrated data, and they were none the wiser. And you go back to SolarWinds, we all have PTSD in the supply chain at this point. Everything is about third-party risk and trying to mitigate that. You know, the effects are still being, you know, felt today. And then you've got a credit score, which is every adult here. You know, you were affected by the Equifax breach, and now you had to get credit monitoring and freeze your credit all of these things. You have this synthetic identity theft problem that's been popping up. And at this point, it's like every other day there's some kind of breach. And the worst part is things are converging now into the physical world. So we need to do something to stop the pain. So if any of you remember Jimmy McMillan from 2012, he ran on a platform about the rent being too high. And he was definitely right. But the cost of cybercrime is also way too high. 2021 costs about $6 trillion to the global economy. The prediction is in 2025, it'll be about 10.5 trillion. Roughly every 39 seconds, a business is breached. FBI last year had 847,000 cyber complaints. But I'm here to give you some hope and hopefully a solution on how we can fix this. If you look back at some of the largest breaches as far as the number of records go, it took 212 days on average, based on the IBM report, to even know that a company's been breached. That's entirely too long. By then, they've run off with the crown jewels and they've done everything they need to do. So if you look at Cam4, what's interesting about that service, it's a naughty webcam site, but 10.88 billion accounts, there's only 7 billion people. Obviously, people had multiple accounts because they probably didn't want to reveal that they were on this site. But Yahoo got breached multiple times, Yahoo Sports, Yahoo Fantasy, 3 billion. And then in India, in, I think, 2017, this was their government ID program that had lofty expectations, but was a epic failure because every single citizen of India had their data leaked. And the worst part was 401k was tied to their Social Security, to their bank account, everything just in one identification system. So their life is effectively ruined at that point. So with that said, let's talk about how canaries fit into this equation. Back in the day, until 1986, they'd use actual birds, when they went mining as an early warning system. And that's no longer cool, but we can use them in our code. And canaries, they come in two forms. You got honeypots, which are known as birds, and then you got honey tokens, which are canary tokens. And birds manifest as real devices. You can have a SCADA system, a smart coffee machine, a dumb terminal, database server, and these things are so real, you'd be hard-pressed to tell anyone that this isn't an actual device. And I'll show you just how convincing this looks here soon. And then you've got canary tokens, and this is where the creativity is your only limitation, because you can literally token anything. You can take a piece of data, a text file, DNS record, spreadsheet, even QR codes now. And I'll walk through each of these examples. And the idea is you layer them in a sort of deception inception model, which is where everything will kind of culminate at the end. And you end up essentially creating a minefield that's hard to avoid. So at some point, an adversary is going to trip over something, and then they're going to trip over something else. And along the way, we're going to gather a pretty detailed forensics trail. And when it's all said and done, we may not have all the information to de-anonymize them, but if we provide it to a third-party company, we've given them like a huge advantage. And you'll see how this works. So let's talk first about the bird's word. Let's talk about from window to the Lulz. I don't know if any of you remember Microsoft Binbos. It was a Japanese computer repair shop that also had a modified version of Windows XP that was really secure because all it had was sticky notes, calculator, and notepad. So the attack surface was pretty small. And, a lot of people, organizations that are over 10 years old probably use Active Directory. And Active Directory runs on domain controllers. And the reason you use this is you want to manage your users, machines, passwords, files, you name it, in a central location. This is really attractive to an adversary. If you can compromise AD, normally you can do everything. You can read emails, log into any computer, listen to traffic. So of course people are going to want to come to this. So the idea here is we deploy a bird that actually is legit, not like this, and we want to see what happens when this domain controller is interrogated, and you'll see. So for those that know Nmap or don't, it's a classic tool for service enumeration and port scanning. So what I did here was I just ran an Nmap scan with various ports targeting a Windows domain controller, right? And if you look at each of the service ports, you've got very convincing information about the services. You know, you look at port 80, it's running Windows Internet Information Services. In fact, if you were to visit that IP on port 80, you'd hit an IIS page, and it would even let you put credentials in too. It's, you know, it's so hard to tell the difference. You can customize the directory information. If you look here under 88, which is Kerberos, which is used for authentication, you got realm.kdc, and it says 80.thinks.com. You can make it be besides PGH, whatever you want for your company to make it blend in with the rest of your systems. And then you even look at, you know, like Microsoft SQL Server. It's a dumb idea to run that on a domain controller, but people do it all the time. And it even tells you what version you have and so on. And then the moment you run the scan, a lot of things happen. It lights up the Christmas tree for you. No need to do it yourself. So on the left side, here's a bunch of aggregated alerts that you're going to get. Not only do you get notified that there's port scanning happening, but you're also going to be notified that somebody tried to log in with FTP credentials. And it'll even tell you what username and password. And they can try all day, but there's nothing of value on these birds. You even have Microsoft SQL authentication, so if somebody's trying to log in with SA, which is common, you know, it's going to fire an alert. And even custom service ports, you know, if they run like a telnet command or netcat, it'll capture all this information. On the right side, you can see kind of more information. You gathered the user agent, so this is already helpful, right? We know now that whoever visited is coming in on, or using Nmap on a Windows machine, essentially. And we also know, we don't have their IP yet, but we will. Actually, we do have the IP. Look at there's a Slack alert right there. It tells you the IP, so you can start to do some reverse geolocation. This is actually my IP in Richmond. And this is our first warning system, and it's only going to get more robust with our information profile over time. Ted Stevens, he was not exactly right when he said the internet is a series of tubes. It's not a big truck. I mean, it's not a series of tubes. It's not a big truck. It is mostly noise. And specifically, it's just gray noise. And if any of you have used a service, you know that it's a really great way to gather contextual information for birds that you want to deploy in a traditional research mode. So the bird that previously was deployed is essentially a production honeypot. And this differs from 20 years ago when honeypots really just sat on the internet and listened for signals, and there wasn't really anything interesting to you in particular. But what has shifted is these birds that you deploy are in your environment, normally one hop away from your public infrastructure, and so they're going to only alert you when it's relevant. But that said, Canary has a traditional honeypot called the outside bird, and I wrote like a very basic bash script on GitHub that pulls in the alerts, the IPs, and it runs it through gray noise, and it gives you context. So essentially what gray noise does is it says, we know Shodan has these scanners, we know Cloudflare has CDNs, we know all these IPs. We're going to filter them out. We're going to filter out benign, malicious, and we're going to leave you, these 4,000 IPs will give you 900. So it's a great way to automate for analysts the process of, manually going through and checking all these IPs. Free service, community API, highly recommend checking them out. And another native integration, Canary and Rumble goes together like George Foreman grilled tilapia for sure. And there's a native integration. So when you're in Canary, you can hover over the hourglass, and it takes you directly to Rumble. What's neat here is Rumble automatically builds an asset inventory and gives you a lot more enrichment and context. So it tells you, services, location, the autonomous system number on the internet, when it was seen. And so you can determine, okay, did this Canary token fire from one of my assets? If so, I should probably look into that, Like this was really helpful for Log4 Shell. You could start gathering information on public IPs, and if machines were communicating, to C2 servers and surreptitiously, you'd probably, need to investigate that. Another free, awesome tool, HD Moore, who wrote Metasploit. This is his company. It's awesome. Highly recommend checking it out. Okay. With birds taken care of, let's talk about the tokens, and the tokens all the way down. And we're going to start with Chris Farley and Black Sheep and recon tokens. These are going to be tokens that people use before they even have access to your network. And there's ways that you can gather information on them to figure out what they may be wanting to do and why they're targeting you. So one of the first tokens we can use is a domain name system token. And the reason domain name system exists is because most people aren't weirdos and like me that memorize IP addresses. You want to type in, B-sides PGH. Behind the scenes, you've got an internet protocol address. That's where, you know how to route traffic on the internet. The way that we can use these tokens really effectively is we can create DNS entries and map them to unused or dark network segments. So you can create entire virtual LANs that should never be used, and you can have DNS pointing there. So if somebody is enumerating those network segments, it's going to fire this token, and you're going to know Snoop Dogg's in the building, snooping around. And when this token fires, it doesn't tell you the IP of the host, it tells you the IP of the DNS server. But even with that, it was able to determine that I was coming from Richmond, Virginia, where I live, and I was using Cloudflare, their 1112 DNS server in particular. So this is like a great initial token just to alert you that people are mucking around and trying to do reconnaissance. So this is really helpful. And if we continue along that path, one of my favorite tokens is called Web Redirect. And you can get so much information from Nosy O'Donnell just by having them visit a site. So there's a doppelganger domain that I bought and transferred to Canary called Things.io. And when you would hit Things.io, it would quickly redirect you. And when you actually buy the service, it doesn't say canarytokens.com. It uses your own domain so that it looks legitimate. But it sends you there, then it redirects you to B-sides. And in the process, it grabs tons of information. It grabs your browser, user agent, IP, if you have JavaScript, Windows. After a while, you can start to, shrink the pool of potential people this may be. So like hardware surveys get captured all the time. If you use Steam for video games, they always ask you, send your hardware specs. Microsoft asks you to send your hardware specs. So there's a good understanding of how many Windows computers might exist here in Pittsburgh, and then how many people use Firefox. And you can see how you can start to de-anonymize and have a more targeted forensic pool than if you just tried to cast a wide net. So this is where we're starting to build the trail until we get to the end, and that's when things get real. Okay, any dodgeball fans out there? There's a token here called a clone website token. This is actually incredibly helpful for knowing when people are trying to impersonate your company or they're trying to start a phishing campaign. So I've actually seen this token be effective in allowing for a cease and desist of domains. Like you get notified, hey, somebody's deployed this, contact the registrar, and you send them a scary letter with your legal team. 9 times out of 10, they're going to tear this domain down and kind of give up on their campaign. This is really helpful. All you do is you create the token. It gives you 5 lines of JavaScript. You don't need to be technical, just embed it in your HTML pages. And then if they clone it, redeploy it anywhere, fires an alert, get the IP, you get some basic headers, and yeah, this is good information. Burt Macklin is on the job. APIs, alert, protect, investigate, or application programming interface. But now we're going to talk about API-specific tokens and how great they are. Starting with the cloud, the AWS. So probably my favorite token is the AWS, Amazon Web Service API key. This looks just like a pair of normal credentials, but when you use them, you can't do anything, but you also don't know that they're not permissioned. You can, though, actually lead people down a path, and you can provision credentials that have access, fake access to an account, and then you can continue to allow them to do things so that you gather more information. But in general, these have no permissions. But when they use these keys, it starts to get even more information. it'll start to tell you the commands that they run. If they hit any of the buckets, it'll tell you the operation that happens. And what's really cool on the left is it builds this incident map, and this is on the free think site, canarytokens.org. So one thing to mention is, you can spend like $5,000 a year, which is the best bang for the buck, and get a hosted console, or you can do this yourself for free, and you can generate tokens galore. And when you do, it tells you everywhere geographically that this key is used. The idea here is like, you can automate deployment using something like Jam for Intune. You can put it on every single machine. And if marketing all of a sudden fires an alert, you probably have a good indication, well, their machine's been compromised. But what a lot of bad actors will do is they're not going to run it on that machine. They're going to grab the keys and use it, and in the process, continue to de-anonymize themselves because it's grabbing the IP, grabbing the particular user agent, like did they use Bodo 3, Python, or did they use some other SDK? So you're just continuing to grab more and more information and build this forensics trail, while you're deceiving them and leading them along the path. Yeah, and speaking of bang for the bucket, this is where you can start to really layer things in. So with Amazon Web Services, you've got these simple storage service buckets, and over the years, these things have been pwned left and right. You've had people accidentally storing credit card information, personal health info on these buckets, and security was optional with AWS, for initially. Your bucket policies weren't strict by default. A lot of times it'd just be world writable and anonymous, and people didn't realize that they were putting sensitive information. And so given the nature of this zero trust world we live in, companies will get breached. It's just a matter of when and how badly. We know this is a fact. This is the only sensible way to operate in our modern world. So we just have to make sure when our preventative controls fail, and they will, we have the ability to detect things immediately. So all you need to do is create a bucket. You can name it something that blends into your existing buckets, and the mere act of just listing an account will fire an alert. And you can tie this in with the AWS keys, and you can give them permissions into a bogus account with S3 buckets, and you can have them spin their wheels and think that they're doing something that's valuable, but it's really not. And so in the process, you go through, you get more information on the user agent. We learned here, looks like they're on Linux, and they're running Bodo SDK in Java. Even tells you here on the right, the actual operation, just the head, just to hit the bucket. IP, same deal, time, even the user, right? And so you can kind of customize that as well and make this look super convincing. And one thing with Canary that's great is you have almost an unlimited number of endpoints to send alerts to. So you can email, SMS, Slack, generic webhooks, Splunk, you name it, you can send data to it, even just generic syslog. And I recommend you do because, you should be sending this to your SIM and building the forensics trail. Canary by itself, it gathers this data, but their whole pitch is they don't want you spending time in the console. They really do just say, take 5 minutes, deploy it, and then don't look at it. And most security companies, you have to constantly babysit the product, but this is one in which it really just works. Yeah, and we've also got Slack tokens, and I like to go meta with these and do things like dropping them in your Slack space so you can take your face back to MySpace. No, but the idea here is you could put these in public Slack channels so that if people are compromising a Slack account, they're going to look around. They might search for XOXP or XOXB, which indicates either a personal or bot token, and they'll find it and they think they got something. You can drop these in your code repositories, drop them on people's machines. Possibilities are endless. And they have no permissions, but they're really appealing. You ask any pen tester, including Haroon, who founded Thinks, if he would pass over a set of API credentials. No. Anyone that comes across credentials is going to try to use them. Slack tokens are no exception. And Exhibit, Exhibit pulls it all together here for us. And then on the API front, we also, the latest token, which is super cool, It's a Kubernetes, or K8, because it's K, 8 letters, get it, and an S. And the whole point of Kubernetes is managing massive amounts of what are called containerized applications, which is like the next iteration of virtual machines. You know, container is like a self-contained environment where you don't, it's platform agnostic. You just spin it up with something like Docker or whatnot. But we can actually create a Kubernetes config file, and similar to AWS, we can drop these on people's machines automatically and fire alerts when they try to use it. And similar to AWS, we also grab information on the user agent. So we'll know what version of the kubectl CLI tool they use, what endpoint they hit, all the really useful pieces of information. And it looks just like a regular Kubernetes config file. Behind the scenes, though, it's hitting, you know, a bogus endpoint that Canary kind of like masquerades. It's brilliant. And I've seen this fired, you know, probably half a dozen times. All right, we're going to talk about some tokens to protect your telephones and your devices. These are personally useful for everyone here now, and so I'd recommend, you know, creating the following. So there's a really neat token Canary released last year. It's called, so WireGuard is a new virtual private network protocol. It's faster than OpenVPN. It uses some different cipher suites, and it's just more reliable. And you can create like a bogus WireGuard profile with the idea that if your phone is compromised, and it's really hard to know, you know, last year you had the Pegasus spyware that was hitting political dissidents' phones, and, you know, it was really hard to detect unless you did deep forensics. I mean, it happened to Jeff Bezos in 2020, allegedly when the Saudi Arabian government hacked his phone. So, like, how would you even know that your phone got pwned? Well, one thing you can do is use this token to create, you know, a VPN profile, name it something that sounds appealing, like, you know, corporate VPN or production, whatever. And then if somebody turns it on, because it's not going to be you because it's useless, it's going to fire an alert. One important thing to notice about these tokens, make sure you use a memo that isn't test. Make it actionable and relevant. So I like to automate this typically by using like variables of host name of the machine and then username. So something token on whatever. But otherwise you're going to be like, where is this token? And, you know, because there are companies that literally have hundreds of thousands of tokens. And the more the better. You get unlimited with things. So you should be deploying this everywhere and anywhere. But I love this. And you totally can pull out your phone right now and scan this code because, you know, bad guys hate it when you do this one weird trick. QR codes are really versatile, and there's a lot of things that you could do with this. You could put this around your office and say, here's the new Wi-Fi password, but you know full well that you don't actually give out the Wi-Fi password because you probably push it out securely. So anyone that's trying to get it is probably just up to no good. But one use case that I've seen that's really effective is if you have multi-factor, you can drop an unread email in everyone's mailbox and make it look like it came from Okta or Duo and say, hey, you got a new device, scan this bad boy and enroll it. And then when they do, it's going to send them to some funny site and have like some lyrics from Top Gun or I don't even remember because it's randomized and where it goes. You can rickroll them. You can do whatever you want. And at that point, they're probably going to like tread a little lightly. You know, it's all about psychological warfare. And as you're going along and playing mind games with them, they're going to be more inclined to want to leave. And on that note, it's trippy, but let's talk about mind games. This is where it gets really fun. This is all about the information warfare, where you get to manipulate data to convince people that they're losing it. So this data basically, database is just asking to be dumped because databases are treasure troves of valuable bits. You know, everyone wants the database. It's usually got credit card numbers. It's got social security numbers. We can make this thing look super convincing. Call it NFT payments table or call it, you know, accounting backup, whatever. You know, you can create a MySQL token and you can drop these things everywhere. You know, you can put them in Amazon Web Services and use them within your existing databases or use your imagination, right? And then once I go to open this, you know, database just running a command, there's all kinds of gibberish. I mean, it looks legit, but it's completely useless. But then in the process, you know, we get another alert here. we figure out, oh, there's the host name, that's helpful. So if they have a specific MySQL client inversion, it'll tell us that, and again, that starts to limit our profile of they're using this certain version of this, and we can start to, like pilot together and start building this profile of who people may be. What if Conspiracy Keanu made the realization that conspiracy theories are actually conspiracy realities? So this is a fun little trick, right? You create a Google Doc or a Word doc, name it something that everyone wants to open if they're up to no good, like organizational structure, go-to-market strategy, IPO, whatever, and then you hit them with a truth bomb. So you tell them something that they may not know. Maybe that leads them to, walk away and question, everything that they're doing. MK Ultra is a highly illegal CIA program that, likely created the Unabomber, among other things. But you could also drop something in about Operation Northwoods, or write a whole story about the JFK assassination as if you know what happened. Just confuse them and bewilder them. At this point, they're probably going to go away. And this is a good point to mention. There's another really neat service called BitTrap that's experimenting with this whole idea around giving people bug bounties, but differing amounts depending on how far along they go in the process. So when you kind of use Canary, you can have certain checkpoints and say, all right, they popped my web server. If you leave now, I'll give you this, $5,000. But if you keep going, you're going to get less and less money, and also we're going to come for you. And it's a pretty neat service. I don't think they're officially partnered with Canary, but it works well, just like anything. It integrates perfectly. So there's a lot of really neat things you can do along that line. And it doesn't just stop with Google Docs. We can spread some bullish. I just love puns. But I'm fascinated with D.B. Cooper because the FBI closed the case in 2016. We still don't know what happened to him. And, maybe the person that reads this is going to go reopen the case and do something useful other than try to, break into your network and, be a scumbag. But, you can drop stuff in here, whatever you want it to be. I really am curious what happened. I mean, he jumped out of the airplane with $200,000. He probably lost it all, but they're still going to give a $100 million reward. So if anybody knows, and there's a funny HBO documentary about people that claim to know where DB Cooper is, but they don't to this day. But that said, hey, use your imagination. Whatever you can think of that might be interesting and might educate them, this is what you should do. Cool. So now we've worked up to this point to a 7-layer dip of deception, inception, and this is where it starts to get really fun, and this is where you tie it all together. So the idea here, for example, you got an adversary who pops, say your actual web server. Maybe it's running Apache struts, it's vulnerable, it has to be on the web right now or something. There's so many situations you can think of where you can't upgrade this because of that software dependency. So let's just say you're stuck with this vulnerable server. Well, what you can do is wrap it in tokens. You can do things like the netstat process, which is one of the first commands an adversary will run to get situational awareness. We can actually wrap that in a DNS token. So when they run netstat, it'll fire an alert. And then it'll start to build everything into your Nosy, I'm such a dork, security incident event management system. And then that's part one, right? So they run netstat, and then, Nmap happens to be there. That's helpful. Well, once they run Nmap, they're going to hit a Windows server conveniently. That's a file share, let's just say. There's a document on there that has some credentials that give you access to a bucket. 7 layers. You're gathering all this different disparate pieces of information. You're sending it to Liam Neeson, and he will find you, and he will kill you, or he will at least turn the information over to the authorities. And, this is just one example. There's so many things you could do. Again, this is why I love this, is not only does it lean on your kind of like analytical brain, but it requires you to be creative and think of different scenarios as a bad actor of what you may do. What are you interested in if you have a background in offensive security? What's your approach? And you kind of think of it from the other side of well, how am I going to trip myself up? And you're kind of playing a cat and mouse game with yourself, and there's bonus points if you have a team that you can constantly like run these exercises with, because you're just going to keep getting better at the end of the day. And with that, I wanted to thank you all so much and open it up for questions and comments. It's all hand. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to share it out on Sketch, and also, yeah, you can hit me up on Twitter. I'm not very big in the social media world. I'm pretty much a ghost. However, I created an account so that I could interact. It's just at Justin T. Varner. Send me a message. I love this stuff. I love security, and I love coming up with solutions. You know, I think my generic title, I gave myself a security philosopher. So I just think about problems and solutions, and I think we all kind of do that in some way. But yeah, I'd love to talk more about all of this stuff because it's super fun. What else? Bueller. Okay. Got a quiet audience. Thank you guys. You're the best.